Absolutely delighted to be here, adding my voice to the push for gender equality in sport. I'm all about the big picture. As you can see by my topic, I've never really shied away from a challenge. I feel as though I've been put on this earth to change the Australian sporting landscape. That's the way I'm wired. I want to make a difference before I die. And so this is what I'm about, you know, the big picture stuff. Even when I was a teenager, I declared that I would play netball for Australia. I've always had really lofty goals and ambitions. I wasn't really aware that I was, 5'0". I thought that I had the talent that would get me all the way to the top. So that never happened. I never played for Australia. But I am now trying to change the Australian sporting landscape. This is my happy place, talking about women's sport and equality. And the good news is that people are starting to listen. I certainly couldn't say that 10 years ago, 5 years ago, or even 2 years ago. The changes that I'm excited about have all really started to happen over the past couple of years. The mood has changed. And I think working in sport, you would know that. And I'll be saying some things today that, you will already know. But the mood has changed, which is good for our women athletes, it is good for society, and it's good for somebody like me who spends a lot of time talking and writing about this subject. My latest book, that makes it sound like that I've written a lot of books. My second book, Breaking the Mould, Taking a Hammer to Sexism in Sport, is bursting with my observations and experiences over 20 years in sport. If I'd included everything that I wanted to say, it would have started to resemble Tolstoy's War and Peace. It is only 277 pages long, but there is a lot more that I could have said. But I want to talk about why I wrote this book. It was something I've been wanting to do for a while. And every book begins with an idea. In my case, I carried that idea around in my head for nearly 20 years before I did something about it, before I found the courage to turn it into a book. As I said, I've spent 20 years of my life working in sport as a journalist, presenter, and now a documentary maker. That is 20 years of observing the Australian sporting landscape, 20 years of seeing women athletes undervalued, underpaid and ignored, 20 years of watching girls drop out of sport because there isn't a pathway for them, 20 years of invisible female role models, 20 years of news editors telling me that no one really cares about women's sport. But if an AFL player busts a toenail, well, you've got to get down there and cover that story because that's really massive. 20 years of watching men with mediocre talent get all the good jobs. That's a bit personal, that one. 20 years of not always feeling like I belong. And people say to me, well, it didn't look like that. For 10 years you sat at the desk and you read the sport and you were very much a part of the landscape. But I didn't always feel like I belonged. And back when I started 20 years ago, there weren't many women, in this role. So I felt like an outsider. And I had also come from Adelaide, so I was doubly weird when I arrived here. They didn't know how to handle me. Sport should be about equality, fairness and respect, but for so long it hasn't been. And this is the uneven playing field of Australian sport. The attitude that sport is men's business is deeply rooted in sport. It's as much a part of sport as running, sweating and moaning about the penalty that the ref failed to see. So my book idea was, why is this the case? Why is the sporting landscape so unfair? Why is it so heavily masculine? Well, of course, it took me back to ancient Greece, and I have to blame my people, the ancient Greeks, for that one. They started this whole sport and masculinity thing more than 3,000 years ago. They created the ancient Olympics. We Greeks invented most things. And then they decided women would not be allowed to compete, and this was the beginning of it. So the blokes have had quite a significant head start on us. but we are making up ground, and I'll get to the good stuff soon. Everywhere I turned in sport, there was evidence that sport was skewed in favour of men. So I knew that I would have plenty of material, but would I be courageous enough to write about it? Would I be courageous enough to shatter that belief that sport is fair? Because we're in a country where we always talk about fairness, a fair go, fair dinkum, fair, what are those things? Something about a sauce bottle? Fair, the Kevin Rudd one. All those sayings about fairness. But in sport, it talks a fair game, it talks about fairness a lot, but it hasn't really been like that for half the population. So after reaching a personal tipping point, I decided to do something about it. And in 2015, I started to write my book. And that year is really important. Clearly I'm psychic because I chose the right year to start writing my book. When I started writing, though, I was writing in anger. It was a cathartic exercise, another Greek word, cathartic. It was all about letting out my frustrations because for, the best part of 20 years, I hadn't seen much change for women in sport. When I started writing in 2015, my son was 2 at the time, and he would drag his toys into my study and he'd sit on the floor and he'd watch me banging away on the keyboard in anger. I'd stop for a minute, I'd break out into a rant about how unfair it all is, drop a few expletives and then continue tapping away. That was his introduction to my life and and to feminism, really. For now, he just thinks I'm completely mad. But one day, when he's a little older, I'll explain that that was a really solid foundation for him to see it firsthand, an angry woman trying to make a difference. And as I started to write, my special powers kicked in. Something magical started happening on and off the field. The Matildas took us on that joyous ride all the way to the quarterfinals of the World Cup. And as we know, they beat Brazil on the way. The Australian women's cricket team regained the Ashes on foreign soil. The netballers won the World Cup and got a 5-year commercial TV deal. Michelle Payne became the first woman to win the Melbourne Cup in its 155-year history. The Opals qualified for the Olympics, nothing unusual there. The WBBL started up and the AFL brought AFLW forward 3 years. So all of these performances, these athletes and these bold decisions by some of our major sports were doing something very important to the landscape, to the well-being of women's sport. They were working their way into the public's consciousness and they were generating a shift in mood and momentum, the shift in mood and momentum that we're really enjoying now. So our sportswomen had a magnificent year in 2015, but more importantly, they ignited something much bigger, change. Change which up until then had been as slow as continental drift. And the Matildas led the way off the pitch too with their demands for a decent base salary and respect. And that word respect started to catch on. Some organisations even learned how to spell it. So it became this movement, and the Matildas have a very special place in the book, in my heart, in society, for igniting a lot of this and for changing the conversation and the language. Respect is really important. And sometimes you have to disrupt business as usual to be heard. And Billie Jean King did this in the 70s, and look what she created, the WTA and equal pay for women tennis players at major tournaments. So at this time, we're starting to hear athletes talk about their sport differently, and that started to catch on. And we all have to reject the notion that women athletes should be grateful that they get the opportunity to play elite sport for the love of it. So this tired old mantra has been ingrained in women athletes, but thankfully it is on the way out. And we can thank the US women's national soccer team for taking a stand against gender inequality in sport and inspiring others to do the same. And in my book, I look at the Matildas of 2015 and I looked overseas and I tried to look at global trends and, I wondered whether our great footballers were inspired by their sisters overseas, because the women over there took a really strong stand. Maybe I have a romantic notion of the whole thing, but I'd like to think that they drew some strength from the messages that were coming from overseas. So the past 2 years have changed the conversation about women in sport. No longer is the word equality an afterthought. Equality has become central to the whole discussion, where it belongs front and centre. This is, first and foremost, a matter of fairness. This sets me apart from some people in sport, because up until now, it's always been about the business case for change. The men at the top of sport have argued the business case for change should be the starting point. In my book, I argue the moral case for change is more compelling than the business case. And I did a basketball breakfast a couple of weeks ago, and the head of Fox Sports, Patrick Delaney, was there. And he very eloquently argued that the business case was the starting point, and I challenged him on that. And it was a really interesting discussion, because you could see people thinking, well, perhaps if we took a different approach and went with the moral argument first, we might see this change happen more quickly. Because the moral argument simply is that girls deserve the same opportunities and pathways in sport as boys. If we change our thinking and start from that point, we'll see a fairer landscape more quickly, and the business case will follow. That's my argument in the book. That should be our starting point. So the events of 2015 were the culmination of decades of hard work by women and men in sport who pushed for women's sport to be valued equally to men's. And as much as I'd like to think that my words inspired change and unshackled women from tired old stereotypes, it really had nothing to do with me. Or perhaps I am a good witch and I have special powers. I'm not sure. I've certainly got the nose to be a witch. So after almost 20 years of watching the struggles of women in sport, I can at last see real and meaningful progress. The future is bright. This book is very different to the one that I pitched to a number of publishers at the start of 2015. As I said, I was angry. I was on a mission to write an angry book. And I had to change it because good things started happening. I forgot to tell my publisher that I'd changed the structure of my book, and sort of halfway through the year I said, oh, by the way, it's very different now. My magical powers have taken effect and the landscape is changing. So the good news is the first half does look at why the landscape is uneven, and the whole ancient Greece, traditions, customs, bias, both conscious and unconscious, it's all in there. But when you get to the halfway point of the book, the tipping point, you start to sort of, run around the lounge room with your jumper over your head, your top over your head. It gets very exciting because the change is compelling. We're now seeing clearer pathways opening up for girls in sport. Female sporting role models are more visible, and we've seen that with the Matildas now. We can actually see them on free-to-air commercial TV. And isn't the sporting landscape more interesting when women are visible and we hear their stories? Nothing against men. I love men. But, isn't it wonderful that we can now see at the end of a sporting match women interviewed? And it is different. We are different. It's a good thing. Different sense of humour, sensibility, life experience. They're candid. It's been great as a fan just to hear their voices and see them. Also, casual sexism is being called out, and this is really important because there's a link between casual sexism, which demeans, degrades and diminishes women, and the sorts of attitudes that give rise to violence against women, the stuff at the very serious end of the spectrum. The following statements are beginning to fizzle out. Women's sport is boring. They're not as strong as men. They're not as fast as men. It's just not as physical. Why would I pay to see that? We've all heard those comments before. They are not only disappearing, but those people who make those comments are now looking like the lunatic fringe in society. They're not keeping up as society is evolving. To me, they are irrelevant, and people try and bait me all the time on social media to respond to the dinosaurs out there, and I don't care so much about the dinosaurs and their attitudes. I'm more about bringing the younger people up into a world that is equal. The others, I'm not listening. So we're finally looking at both men and women and celebrating and embracing their differences. And let's face it, the world would be an unbearably boring place if we were all the same. But the key is to value the differences. Women's sport is physically different to men's, but that doesn't make it any less strategic or passionate. In fact, you could argue relying less on brute force puts more of an emphasis on tactics and strategy, making it more of a spectacle. Well, certainly a more nuanced spectacle. To assume contests involving power and speed are better to watch than those that showcase grace and skill is a pretty one-dimensional way to look at things. It's like saying Cathy Freeman's gold medal run at the Olympics, that was okay, but it wasn't as exciting because she's nowhere near as fast as Michael Johnson's world record time. I mean, it is ludicrous. We should stop comparing the two. Despite all these advances, there's still a way to go. Women athletes are still striving for equal pay, and the book takes a very measured position when it comes to money and equal pay. Maths has never been my strong point at all, but I'm not silly enough to expect pay parity overnight. What I argue for is a decent base salary for our women athletes, and from there it can grow. So, tennis is an interesting example, and I won't go into it, but tennis is very different. Tennis has a few natural advantages over other sports, a lot to do with the word femininity, so tennis is great that the women have equal pay, but there are more challenges if you are playing a traditionally masculine sport. You have more obstacles to overcome. So when it comes to pay, let's continue to fight. Let's fight for a decent base salary so our athletes don't have to do 2 or 3 other jobs as well. We still don't have access to the same resources and facilities as men in sport. A sportswoman's worth is still based on her attractiveness or sex appeal. Sexist jokes and throwaway lines are still part of the landscape, and women continue to be underrepresented in positions of power, including the media. The challenge now for women's sport is to keep the momentum going, to build on those gains from 2015. Winning will help, of course it will. And, as beautiful as it is to win a World Cup, Oceania Cup, Asian Cup or Olympic gold, it can't get to the root of the problem. It takes more than winning to reduce the pay gap. It takes more than winning to change sexist attitudes. It takes more than winning to get more media coverage and sponsorship. Because if you think about our women athletes, we've won more than our men. So if it was based on winning alone, we would be at the top of the tree. And we're not, because we are dealing with the ancient Greeks and all that stuff from 3,000 years ago. All of us have a role to play in making the sporting landscape fairer for girls and women. Together, we can make sure the rise of women in sport continues. And people always say, well, just always whinging about it, and you're going to offer up any solutions? There are plenty of solutions in my book, right? And the whole you're a whinging woman in sport thing, I don't cop that at all. I mean, when it comes to whinging, there are some examples of men whinging. They hold their own. But jokes aside, I do offer up some solutions. To keep the momentum going, we, as lovers of sport in all of our different fields, capacities, have to lead the way by encouraging others to value girls and women in sport. It's obvious, we all do it, but get other people to get out there and watch it, talk about it, tweet about it, Instagram and all the other business. We've got to celebrate women in sport. We have to call out bad behaviour, and this can be difficult. I've got a whole chapter, the hardest chapter to write, or maybe equal hardest. The media chapter was hard too. But I've got a chapter devoted to the difficulty of speaking out, and I've called it complicity. I was complicit. There was a lot of bad stuff going on when I started as a journalist in sport, but I just wanted to, and further my career. I wanted to thrive. I wanted to run with the pack. So the last thing I wanted to do was to speak out and be labelled a difficult woman. So I was complicit, and something really unpleasant happened to me when I first moved here. And I chose not to say anything about it because the man involved was high profile in sport. And as I said, I just arrived from Adelaide. I was new, and I just wanted to carve out a career in sport, which back then, of course, was very male-dominated. But thankfully, this is all changing. All we have to do is look to Hollywood, and we can see it is changing very, very quickly. We also have to stop comparing women's and men's sport. I touched on this earlier. Equality is about being valued for who you are. You should never be forced to take on the characteristics of others. We are gloriously different, and that should be celebrated, not denigrated. And following on from that, we have to give girls time to grow into those sports that are relatively new to them. The measure of success should be participation, not how many goals they score or saves they make. And I know that the rise of girls and women in traditionally masculine sports like Australian football, world football and cricket is seen by some as a thorn in the side for sports like basketball, netball, hockey, where women have played successfully at the elite level for a long time. I see it differently. It's that big picture thing again. These new sports are creating a more competitive landscape for women and pushing all sports to do more for girls and women, whether it's facilities, pay, conditions, respect, recognition. It's bringing everyone up. So it may be difficult if you're in a sport. I feel for sports like hockey. They've had equality for a long time. They don't get the headlines. We live in Melbourne. The AFL is the headline munching, beast that it is. Those sports that don't understand that this is now a matter of equality, they're going to be left behind. So I think we need to all embrace this competitive sporting landscape for women because the train has well and truly left the station. If you don't see your sport as a matter of equality, you're going to be left behind. People say, netball started it or cricket started it. I don't even really care who started it now. The fact is, it's going, we're up and running. Let's all focus on continuing this movement. In wrapping up, sadly, it's all come too late for my own sporting career, which was cut short by a lack of height and a lack of talent. But I am enjoying the social change, both as a woman who's worked hard for this to happen and in my more recent role as a mother. As I said earlier, I have found my happy place in the media. It's outrageous that it's taken to the age of 48 to actually feel this comfortable in the media. But oh well, I guess it's all that meticulous planning that went on for 3,000 years to get us to this point. I can now talk and write about the culture of sport and gender equality in particular and not feel like an outsider. I've got my second wind. It's dangerous for everybody out there, it really is. In addition to my book, I've directed, produced and written a couple of television documentaries this year about AFLW. The first one, League of Her Own, was on the 7 Network, and the most recent one, Heroes, aired on the ABC in August. And this is where I want to be. I'm now positioning myself, and it's like that point I made at the start. This is good for the athletes. They are, crucial to this whole thing. But for a little person like me, it's also good for me because I can now work on projects that reflect my values, that reflect who I am. And I've really enjoyed covering mostly men's sport. It's been great. It's been a great ride, but it's really feels fantastic now that I can now tell the stories of women. Just taken a little while to get there. So finally, let's keep it going. we can do this. Together we can bring about real change both on and off the field of play. So, you know, I've really enjoyed watching the Matildas earn the respect that they deserve. And it felt like 2015 was a moment for a lot of the population to notice them. Some of us in sport had noticed them a little earlier than that. But just watching their rise has been an absolute joy. And long may they reign, be successful, because there's something very compelling about your sport. And I was saying it earlier, I love Australian football and netball and other sports, but nothing quite beats a World Cup and a national team that we can all feel really proud about on the international stage. So that is it. Are there any questions, or is that a no-no? Wrap it up? Okay. I've been talking for too long. Thank you for having me.